I remember that day clearly. So does everyone else. You can't forget a day like that. A day that lives throughout time, like Pearl Harbor, the towers, the nukes being dropped. Those days are permanently etched inside the human consciousness. And this day was no different. I remember being outside working when I heard my phone go off. In fact, everyone's phone went off. We all looked and saw there was an emergency alert going off. We were all confused. What was going on? And immediately we clicked on and we saw that the emergency alert system had been activated. On the phones, televisions, radios, and everywhere across this country, and I'm sure across the entire planet, everyone was seeing messages from their political leaders stating the same message. It is confirmed we are no longer alone in the universe. Most of us had already speculated that this was true. Most of us realized that the leaders of our respected nations had been hiding this for years and years, decades even, probably even before I started breathing. However, it was at this point it confused everyone why they were confirming the existence of life beyond this floating rock in space. As it turns out, we had visitors. They had shown up outside of lunar orbit. They were so close that even the weakest of satellites were picking up their energy trail, and all sorts of telescopes were being pointed in their directions. There was no way you could miss those massive ships, along with their accompanying support vessels that were floating around it. Everyone watched in sheer shock as this happened. Immediately we looked at each other, and at least where I was, everyone decided, time to pack up, go home, because we don't know what's going on. Nobody's boss, to my knowledge, gave them any crap about that, as everyone wanted to go home and be with their families, just in case. We received a message, and what we saw on the screen shocked everyone to their absolute core. What stared back at us through a recorded message was an elf, at least the closest we could figure it. The sheer deepness of the blue in its eyes, the long ears, the long blonde hair, the pristine skin. It was the epitome of what we know as a high elf. Yes, I know my fantasy. I know my lore. And this made me shudder. If there were elves, what else could there be out in the world? And we would soon find out. But that was nothing compared to what we found out here. Though it was a message of peace, and they said many times, we come in peace, we do not come to start a war. We found out through their words that humans throughout the entire universe had been extinguished. From their home planet, they had been completely destroyed, annihilated, and their cities razed to the dirt, their planets glassed, and nothing was left. We did not know why at that point that this had happened, but somebody must have been royally pissed for that to happen. However, they would soon find that humans were not nearly as extinct, or else they would have realized that we should have been glassed the moment they came into our sector. Why do I say this? Well, as time would tell, as they reached our magnetosphere, something happened. There was a burst from their ship. They warned that they would have to use their magic. And most of us did not believe in sorcery. We had never seen it. We had never known any of it. But they said that their weapons, their ships, their everything runs on magic. This made us nervous. And I remember loading all my rifles and shotguns just in case I had to face sorcery with steel. But as they reached the magnetosphere and that pulse came out, that pulse was simply a way for them to slow down their ships as they were traveling far too fast to stay within orbit of this planet without slingshotting around. The pulse reached the planet and something happened. We did not understand why, but certain areas of the world began to glow, crack, and open up. The world itself shook, as different areas of the world cracked and light poured out, but not just solid bright light. Darkness reached out as well. It reached out to each of us as in tendrils reaching out to every single person to touch onto them. At first, no one knew what was going on. Nobody saw it. All they knew is that there were earthquakes around the world. People confused that they weren't living on fault lines. How could they possibly have an earthquake? And then these tendrils of different colors of light and dark came out to touch them. If you were looking, they would touch you and go into your body without you even knowing. If you saw them, many people tried to back away, tried to swat them away, but they were relentless and eventually would jab into the person. What we found out was that this power was awakening what was buried deep inside us. However, there was a catch. Around the world, through all sorts of CCTV cameras, they could see many people throughout cities being jabbed with this power. It was barely visible to see the tendrils on the video unless you had a certain filter on. However, you could see them start to absorb the power as it awakened what was inside, what was dormant and buried. And yet, some decided they wanted more power. We did not know this until some video came back with audio as people screamed more, more, more as their eyes began to glow and they could see the energy begin to crack through on their pores. It was almost as though they were porcelain dolls as the cracks began to form on their skin, but they seemed to want to draw even more and more power, and eventually they would explode like a water balloon all over the place. Blood, bone, entrails were everywhere. And this happened across the entire planet. Those that craved power among everything else were tore apart by this energy that flowed from the planet itself. For those of us that were not power hungry, we survived, but something else happened to most of us. Not all, but most. I still remember collapsing on the ground, convulsing, trying desperately to stay awake. As pain radiated up my body, I could hear bones cracking, but I didn't feel any pain. But I couldn't stand up, I couldn't move, and eventually, I just went out. It was the same for all of us as we awoke to find ourselves changed, altered in some way. Those that did not convulse and drop to the ground simply absorbed said power, and stayed awake but watched the rest of us convulse on the ground and freak out. It wasn't just humans either. All sorts of animals began to pulsate and move like that. And then as we all laid on the ground unconscious, unable to maintain ourselves as the power of whatever in the hell that was had gone through us, they watched in horror as we changed. I have no idea how long I was out. Some say they were only out for half an hour. Others were out for a week. But the transformation changed most of us. It changed us on the outside, but not on the inside, at least not truly. When I finally awoke, I found my body had changed dramatically. I had grown several inches taller to the point where I almost hit my head a few times walking through the doorways of the house. I looked and my body was much slimmer than it was before. However, I accustomed that to the fact that whatever had happened had made me taller and just stretched me out. But then again, I was insanely hungry at that point. Looking at the news, it was clear that this sort of change had been happening all around the world. Several people who were on the news were still just confused at what was going on as they took video of people changing. And not just changing the way I had, as I had simply seemed to get larger and got my muscle mass back as though I was back in my 20s or something. But then I looked over and they could see one person clearly suffering from lycanthropy and almost looking canine in a way. Another woman, she had started to merge her legs together into some sort of massive tail. Another man, his hands had turned into almost claws, yet he still looked mostly human. The kicker is, when they brought him over towards the light, his skin started to, steam. I didn't have time to sit there and watch this, but I realized something was going on around the world, and then I immediately grabbed a hold of my phone and started calling everybody I know, trying to get some sort of response. Thankfully, I got a response from one of my nieces who said that her sister had started to pass out and convulse. I screamed, "Oh shit," and I'm sure everyone else did when they called their relatives. But what made it worse was their dog had somehow started to grow extra heads, one on each side of its neck, and was starting to scratch and claw, trying to get its way in, and eventually would, as it would eventually break its way through the windows to get into the house. It was a long drive, but I didn't care. Climbing into the car, I had to reset my seat as I had grown so much that I almost didn't fit at all. Hunched over, I didn't care. As I ran gears up, and apparently others had the same ideas, I saw many other cars on the side of the road crashed in to each other or rolled off to the side as they took the corner too fast and didn't know how to work their gears or whatever happened to them. Some were simply running to their neighbor's house. I could see some people trying to flag me down. I didn't have time. I had to go help them out. While I was doing this, I'm desperately trying to call my other relatives to see what the hell was going on, but no one answered. I started freaking out, and everyone else was freaking out. What was going on? What did they do to us? What the hell was going on? I took a 40-minute drive and turned it into 20 minutes as I peeled into the driveway. Sure enough, their giant St. Bernard heard the car come to a stop and ran up towards the fence. And yes, it had 3 heads and had grown much, much larger, but it had also gotten much more aggressive. Usually it was a very passive freaking mutt, but this thing looked like it was ready to chew through the iron bars that were holding it in, and it was trying desperately to get at me. I just looked it square in the eye as I walked by, gave it the knife hand and said, "Sit!" And I felt something in my hand, something not painful, but almost a outward pressure from inside. I didn't think much of it, but the dog immediately took a few steps back and sat down. I ran inside, screaming for my nieces, and sure enough, one of them had not changed at all. She was just herself, maybe a little taller, but nothing else. She ran up to me and grabbed my leg and then immediately backed up, realizing that I had gotten much taller, and I was a lot thinner too. She started freaking out. What was going on? I didn't have anything to tell her. I didn't know. I just asked, "Where's your sister?" She led me over to the other room, and sure enough, her sister had started to change into a color of red. And yes, she had actually begun to get almost the clawed hands and clawed feet. Horns started to protrude from her head, but she was still convulsing on the floor. Why was everyone convulsing like this? I looked and her body seemed to have developed past that of a freaking 12-year-old. What the hell was wrong with this? What was going on? I told her to go grab a blanket for her sister to cover up the convulsing body. Her little sister ran out of the room, came back with a blanket as I made sure everything was good. Her vitals were fine. She was breathing. The pulse was steady. I didn't know what was going on. So I immediately grabbed her, wrapped her up in the blanket, told them both to get in the car. We're heading back to my place out in the woods. I tried to call their parents and didn't get through at first, but I did. Thankfully, they were both okay. But something had happened, and they didn't know what. I told them I had the girls, and they would be staying at my place. I finally got a hold of everyone else, and it seemed as though everyone actually did survive whatever the hell that alien ship did to us. They said they came in peace. Yeah, right. What the hell did they do to us? I sat with the girls and waited for my eldest to wake up. She finally did, but freaked out at the way she looked. She ran into the other room to look into the mirror, dropping her blanket, and the tattered clothes that ripped off her body from its expansion fell to the floor. I had to turn away out of sheer respect, but I also went and got a few of my clothes to give to her. Most of which actually will not actually fit me anymore, and never did since. Realizing that she had actually changed, she looked at herself and realized that she had actually grown a tail out the back. It was strange. And she had actually grown a weird set of small wings that came out of her lower back. And yes, I know what most people are thinking. Why would this be? Well, we would find out later that those that grew wings out the small of their back were all female. Since females are balanced different than men, there's no reason for the wings to be higher up towards the shoulders. Well, that is what we found out later. But at the time, everyone was freaking out. I was getting phone calls from family and friends trying to figure out what was going on. Nobody knew. No, everyone online was still freaking out, but the whole time this was going on, that alien ship was getting closer and closer and closer. That was until we found out that the leaders of each respective nation had actually called up and said, "What the hell did you do to us?" We heard it in real time as we were watching all the news. It all linked up at the same time, amazingly not crashing the entire telecommunications system with everyone watching a single broadcast. This elf looked at us, confused at what had happened. They didn't take any responsibility. They simply stated that they will be landing at the same spot they designated. Everyone watched as they tried to figure out what was going on. What the hell was happening? Why did this happen to us? What did they do? And as the ship again entered the atmosphere, there was another pulse. This time it didn't have the same quite effect, but instead the last remaining craters and fissures where the energy had come from seemed to dissipate. All light slowly faded back in, and the fissures themselves seemed to collapse in on each other. Thankfully, whatever had happened had stopped, and we could finally take account of what had gone on, why they had done this to us, and of course, let's see what we can do to get back at these bastards for doing this. We watched as these elves walked out of their ship. We watched as they walked towards the UN building. We watched as they looked down on us with a sheer, almost prideful look, saying, "You are beneath us." And this really pissed people off, but not nearly as much as what was happening around the world. Around the world, as the elves made their way to the UN building to address everyone, there was different things happening. Different creatures of what was originally thought to be folklore began to appear around the world, and those began to be the highlights. Instead of freaking aliens showing up, now we had things like trolls coming out of the Netherlands, ripping through the power lines and going straight into major cities. 200-foot tall monsters beginning to stomp their way through major metropolitan areas. Not only that, but you had in other areas, you had people turned into vampires, werewolves, and things of that nature. Over in the east, things like yokai became a thing. Over in Brazil, what seemed like dolphins would simply transform into beautiful men who walked out and immediately entranced any woman that they saw into lustful desire. All these different creatures came to be what we thought was nothing more than myth and legend were now fact, and these things had brought this type of battle to us. The elves looked at us with disdain as they told us that throughout history, humans were thought to be extinct. And yet, here we are, alive and well. And yet, as the elf looked around, he did look slightly confused, as there were different creatures now amongst him, more than just human. He stated how elves were the strongest of all. They have pride above all others, and they have dominion above all others. And we must now bow down to them and never try to fight against them, as we are beneath them. Of course, I'm summarizing what he was saying, as the pretentious asshole decided to simply not even look at anyone, but instead literally look down his nose at everyone as he stood there at the podium. Even his guards told those who were sitting behind him on elevated seats to get down so that no one was above him. Even the elf females looked down at the humans and just sheer disgust that they would even breathe the same air. We were told that humanity, that Earth, was now under their dominion. They really did not know who they were fucking with. Without even skipping a beat, many of the cities began to uprise to fight against not only the creatures that had now begun to infest their areas, but also demand blood and retribution for whatever they had done. Many people had committed suicide as they could not understand or deal with the changes to their bodies. Many different bodies ended up floating in rivers as they had simply jumped off headfirst into the concrete pillars. And as the hours passed, dealing with these new troubles, humanity seemed to pull together to face off any type of dangers or perceived dangers there were. And with that, the skies began to fill above the alien ship with human craft, F-14s, F-22s, any type of Mirage, anything that they could get into the air loaded with ordnance was already hovering over. Artillery was dialed in. They were not going to let this ship leave, not without answers. The elves smirked and said, "You do not have this power to face us." And with a wave of his hand, a burst of energy came out, sending many of our aircraft flying in different directions as though some sort of massive airburst had hit them. However, what they did not know is that 5th and 6th generation fighters can easily come back from a maneuver like that. He was a little bit surprised at this, as he didn't think that our aircraft would still be in the air or they would have turned and run. Instead of acting surprised, the elf simply stated how that was a warning to everyone, and we did not know his power, that we underestimated what they could do to us if they so choose. Many people simply looked at their new form and said, "What else can you do, jerk?" However, we would definitely find out, as many of their own elf soldiers began to empty out the sides of the ship, most of which were holding some sort of staff in their hand, and immediately started throwing all sorts of energy around, energy we did not know they could use and did not know how to counter. Some of the energy was used as almost a blade as it whipped through the air, cutting through trees, people, and anything else. Other ones were direct fire energy as they would punch through building, causing them to collapse. Without even receiving the order, the aircraft floating about fired at the enemy ships that were docked on the ground. The enemy ships were surprised that we could come up with any type of technology that could actually damage their ships. We were punching several holes, however, it wasn't enough to keep the ship from beginning to power its engines up. We did not want them to get away, and apparently the entire military had the same idea as they dropped a few bunker busters right through the dorsal hull of the ship. It punched through, and it was clear on everyone's television or whatever the hell you were watching it on that they weren't going anywhere, as the top part of the ship erupted in fire as the explosive charge went off inside, causing several secondary explosions. And as the ship had already tried to lift off, it slammed back onto terra firma. You ain't going anywhere, asshole, is the only thing humans thought collectively. It was only now that the elves showed fear in their eyes. They realized that we could actually fight back. They believed that their abilities and their technology was well beyond ours. Well, a spear is still a spear. It's still lethal if used correctly. And the tip of our spear is covered with tungsten, and that's what came in next. Artillery and tanks began to make their way in. The artillery scattered most of the elves around, and the tanks fired their main guns. However, what they were not expecting is that with just a few seconds of prep time, each of those elves could fire off a blast that was enough to shatter a tank apart. It was something else to see. that this massive amount of force came out of something so small and ripped apart something that big. That put a pinch of fear of everyone. However, it wasn't enough to keep our people from going in and taking down as many of these freaking elves as possible. The elves inside the hall began to blast away with their energy, their magic, their sorcery, and began to take out many, many, many heads of states along with their liaisons. It wasn't long before the elves realized that they were completely outnumbered and didn't have a chance of escaping. One of them, on live TV, swelled up as much energy as it could. You could see the massive energy in between its hands as it held it over its abdomen. A massive ball began to form, a ball so bright that it actually phased out the lens of the camera, causing it to polarize itself to try and see what was still going on. However, it wasn't long before that massive ball was so dense and then burst out in all directions. The UN building no longer stood, as it was blown apart into many pieces. A city block wide explosion happened, which was enough to alert all the rest of the elven fleet. The small support ships came down and immediately started evacuating their people under fire. Well, I give them props for coming to get their people, but they will not stop blasting us with whatever type of magic, sorcery, or whatever the hell that was that they were using. But they did not understand what else was killing them. They didn't realize good old-fashioned gunpowder and firepower is all you're going to need to take them down. Their bodies were still just as squishy as ours, and that's all it took. The elves grabbed who they could and bolted off the planet. Unfortunately, when our aircraft tried to take down the support ships, it turned out the support ships did not waste any time and used that same type of magic pulse to push away our ordnance, and it landed elsewhere, usually among the populace, many of them landing into buildings and blowing them to pieces. However, it wasn't enough to stop us from continuing to fire at them. Watching all this in abject shock, everyone watching was extremely pissed. Who were these creatures to come and face us? Who were these elves to say they were so much better than everyone else? Who were they to say that we fall under their thumb? Who were they to face us and try to break us? Do they not know anything about humans? Well, they're about to find out. After the elf ships had left, their main ship had been secured, and the technology was immediately looked into to be reverse engineered. If the fight is in the stars, it's time to get our butts up there. What came surprising after everything was the fact that many elves were actually captured, and they were captured unconscious. After a little bit of interrogation, it wasn't a surprise to find out that the amazing amount of energy that they were using to blast holes in buildings and take out tanks simply wore them out. It was nothing else but that. It simply exhausted them. But we all looked at ourselves and thought, if they can use magic and they can use technology, why can't we? Time to show the entire universe the humans' version of synergy of sorcery and science.